The best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt with the heart. Helen Keller heavily impacted the educational opportunities of people with visual and auditory disabilities, in addition to becoming a role model and advocate for her disabilities.
Helen Keller was born into a Southern home in Tuscumbia, Alabama on June 27, 1880. Her father, Colonel Arthur Keller, and mother, Kate Adams Keller, raised their children with care and with high expectations for their future. At the age of 19 months, Helen Keller faced a large bump in the road that most people would never dream of facing. She contracted a fever that left her both deaf and blind. As she went through childhood, she became wild, as some would say, because of her disabilities. At the age of 6, Helen Keller was introduced to a woman who would change her life and show her how to survive with these disabilities. Her parents decided to take Helen to Alexander Graham Bell to help, who would then introduce the family to her inspiring and educated teacher, Anne Sullivan. Under Sullivan's wings, Helen Keller was able to master Braille by age 10, as well as the alphabet. The strategies and repetitive lessons she received every day allowed for the material to be ingrained and remembered. She was eventually able to speak clearly enough to be accepted into prep school, which was a huge accomplishment.
Helen Keller would not be the woman she was without Miss Anne Sullivan. Sullivan taught Keller how to speak the English language, a feat no one at the time thought possible for someone with disabilities as serious as Helen's. Keller reflects on her teacher, Miss Sullivan, by saying, "The most important day I remember in all my life is the one on which my teacher, Anne Mansfield Sullivan, came to me. I am filled with wonder when I consider the immeasurable contrast between the two lives which it connects." Anne Sullivan, being visually impaired herself, taught Keller by using the touch teaching technique. Though Keller was stubborn, she eventually had an amazing breakthrough that sparked her learning. Sullivan had Keller place her hands under a water pump as she spelled water into her palm. After this, Keller spelled water many times. From there, Helen Keller went on to read and write like no other blind deaf person had before. Helen Keller was influenced by Anne Sullivan not only in her academics, but her life and attitude as well. She writes many things about her life experiences, and she reflects on questions people have asked her. Miss Sullivan was the one person that could really understand Keller, and she often thought about what her life would be like without her. Keller states, "I have been frequently asked what I should do without her. I smile and answer cheerfully. God sent her, and if He takes her, His love will fill the void. But it terrifies me to face the thought that this question brings to my mind."
With the support of friend Alexander Graham Bell, Helen began thinking about furthering her education to the collegiate level. While Helen's first choice would have been Harvard, Harvard did not accept women in the 1890s. So Helen began to consider her second choice, Radcliffe College. But because she was not receiving a normal primary education and had never really been to school with seeing and hearing students, Helen was immediately enrolled into a second preparatory school. After enrolling in the Cambridge School for Ladies at the age of 16, Helen set her sights on her primary goal, being accepted into Radcliffe College. With lots of help and support from a personal tutor, her teachers at Cambridge, and of course Anne Sullivan, Helen passed all of the entrance exams to Radcliffe and was officially accepted just after her 19th birthday. At Radcliffe, Helen was accompanied by Anne to all of her classes for translation purposes, because little to no professors were prepared to teach a deaf-blind student. In addition to the professors, many students felt awkward and unsure about being in Helen's presence due to her disabilities. Even with all odds against her, Helen worked very hard and proved many people wrong by succeeding in all of her classes. Even though she was still young, Helen became a trailblazer for those with disabilities. While Helen enjoyed college, she noted that student schedules were often hectic and stressful, and didn't leave enough time to be able to just sit and think or spend time doing personal things. She wrote that we should take our education as we would take a walk in the country, leisurely, our minds are hospitably open to impressions of every sort. In 1904, Helen Keller graduated cum laude, or with honors. At 24 years old, Helen showed the world that despite everything against her, a young, blind-deaf woman with determination accomplished her dreams.
Helen Keller's influence was not limited to education alone. She had an active political voice, and her views were seen as politically radical, especially from someone born and raised in Alabama. From 1909 to 1921, she was a supporter and participant of the American Radical Movement. Keller was also a member of the Socialist Party, who openly opposed World War I. Her political involvement reached outside of party affiliation and her view on conflicts. She was also a suffragist. Keller is known to have written a letter to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to push for women to gain the vote. She believed that if women gained the vote, there would be less rush to war and conflict. Keller believed that all people should be equal and none was greater than another. This fueled the majority of her beliefs and the movement that she backed. She continued to be active in political life, constantly pushing for peace and working with political officials. When the question of whether or not to join World War II arose, Keller was in support of joining the war efforts of the Allies. She was anti-war traditionally, but said the only war she believed in was a war to end all wars. The latter part of Keller's life was not devoted solely to sharing her political beliefs. During the early part of the 1900s, her focus was raising funds for the Helen Keller National Center for the Blind. In 1917, the Helen Keller National Center for the Blind included services for the deafblind. Throughout the 1900s, the Helen Keller National Center for the Blind continued to expand, including services for the elderly and infants. In 1962, the Helen Keller National Center for the Blind started the Anne Sullivan Macy Program for deafblind youths to honor Keller's teacher, mentor, and lifelong friend. Just before her death, the Helen Keller National Center for deafblind youth and adults was established by a unanimous act of Congress. Helen Keller died on June 1, 1968, at 87 years old.